Honesty is anathema for entrenched atheists, and this is why they cling to a fraudulent redefinition of atheism to pretend they have no burden of proof, even though it's self-evident that they do hold a belief. Just the examples atheists like to use to compare God against, such as the flying spaghetti monster and Santa Claus, expose their belief. That they think fictional examples are appropriate reveals what they think about God.
Why, yes, it reveals what we think about God, that the descriptions we've been given are too absurd to take seriously. That requires no burden of proof. Our position is as it is because you've failed yours. Let's do this.
BionicDance!
Greetings, fellow space travelers, BionicDance here. Today we're talking to a new fella. Calls himself Douchebags Refuted, so we know he's going to be dealing with atheism fairly and without bias. Like so many before, he's a theist with sour grapes over the fact that not every side in this debate has a burden of proof. Watch how he twists and turns to find some way to make it fair.
Many times I've seen atheists explicitly deny the existence of God and then attempt retroactively to cling to their definition of atheism to escape their burden of proof. I suspect we've all seen examples of this, and even atheists deep down know that this is true. They're just willing to be dishonest for their ideology. The ends justify the means for them.
I just love it when they tell me what my position is, don't you? And how they lump absolutely every atheist in with every other, as if we all think the same things the same way. I suspect he'd get awfully grumpy if we lumped his ass in with, say, those who believe in the Mayan gods or the Egyptian pantheon. I'm just saying. He claims that because he's heard some atheists say that there is no God, then all atheists say that there is no God, that all of atheism is about making a declarative statement, a claim unto itself, and thus atheists have a burden of proof. The problem is that this does not describe my position, nor the positions of many others. My claim is a reaction to theist claims. I've examined them and found them wanting. Thus, I've discarded them. And I go about my day. If nobody claimed that a God exists, I'd have just gone about my day uninterrupted. It's because you jokers brought the topic up that we're even discussing it in the first place. I'm a critic of your ideas. I'm challenging you to back them up in a reasonable fashion, as we'd test the existence of anything else. That doesn't give me a burden of proof, just you.
If you call out an atheist for his comparisons to Santa or the flying spaghetti monster, he'll pretend that it's all about the evidence. They claim that there is as much evidence for God as the flying spaghetti monster, but this only exposes the intellectual bankruptcy of popular atheism. As they claim that the comparison is only made on grounds of evidence, and that they only lack belief in God, they must also only lack belief in the flying spaghetti monster. If they are to be consistent, the atheist cannot admit to a belief against any arbitrarily imagined thing at all. This is where their undergirding logic is shown to be absolutely fucking farcical.
The flying spaghetti monster is made up. The people who invented the idea told us they made it up. There is no claim that the damn thing is anything but an analogy. Indeed, it's explicitly stated that it is an analogy. Unlike God. God's fan club claims he's about as real as anything can be. But that's the whole point of the comparison, to show that the idea of the FSM is nutty and it's not real, and that God's description is just as nutty, so why should we think God is real? Occam's razor. Is it more likely that there's an all-powerful creator being, or that a bunch of ignorant savages from thousands of years ago made shit up, and the God nerds are worse than the Trekkies?
This atheist cannot admit to holding a belief that an indetectable Santa Claus does not descend down his chimney every night and sing him sweet silent lullabies as he falls asleep. This atheist cannot admit to the belief that there is not a civilization of speaking cucumbers who play the banjo and sing Silent Night together under the seas of Neptune. What a position to have backed yourself into. Through the dishonesty inseparable from their culture, they have literally intellectually castrated themselves.
I don't think I've literally intellectually castrated myself, for several good reasons. There is nothing wrong with saying that your mind is open to new data, despite a claim seeming ridiculous enough to just dismiss it. Indeed, that's intellectual honesty. Imagine where we'd be right now if you'd listened to the naysayers regarding humankind and flight, for example. The idea seemed ludicrous, but here we are with air travel being commonplace. Now, I'm not saying that we'll eventually prove that there are pixies living under Yankee Stadium or whatever the fuck. I'm just saying that I'm not prepared to close any doors 100% permanently. If someone can show sufficient evidence that there is a God, I'm not going to stubbornly stick to atheism. I may not become a devotee. That depends on whether or not this God is worthy of worship, which is not a given. But I'm intellectually honest enough to admit I was wrong. I just have no reason to claim so at this time. And that's your fault.
The problem is that while everybody, of course, expects against an invisible Santa singing sweet lullabies to them each night, and thereby holds a tacit belief to that effect, the modern atheist has left himself with no grounds to justify that belief, and so all he can do is deny it. He has no grounds because he's a member of the cult of scientism. Their own standard for evidence is limited to what is naturalistic and observable. They can't dare rely on logic because then they won't be able to deny that there is evidence for example, Jesus' divinity, or the kalam or fine-tuning arguments, etc.
The problem with logic is that it can prove absolutely anything, provided you never have to show evidence. Arguments like Kalam make some baseless assumptions which cannot be backed up, like that the universe couldn't create itself, or that the uncaused cause has to be a personal being and not just a force of some sort. The only reasons we're given for these assertions is that it just seems right, or that we don't have evidence for anything else, so their baseless claims should be treated as reasonable and valid. Logic isn't good enough when you're making a claim as huge as the existence of a god. You're gonna need more. You're gonna need evidence to which you can apply that logic. And you just haven't got that.
As well as a false definition of atheism, they also must cling to a false definition of evidence, and you'll see atheists doing this all the time, claiming there's no evidence just because there's no scientific evidence.
Well, what other kind of evidence should we accept? You're claiming that there's a magical being that has tangibly interacted with our world on many, many occasions, and often in truly far-reaching ways. If that creature exists, there absolutely has to be scientific evidence for it. That's just a given. And if we don't get to have scientific evidence, then what possible, logical, rational reason can there be to suspect a deity is real? And that it's your deity? Because all you have is stories, scriptures, and your legends aren't better than their legends. Besides, your holy text has made claims that can be tested, like the age of the earth, and whether there have been global floods and such. But every time something religious is proved false, it suddenly becomes metaphorical. Convenient, that.
Atheists constantly need to be reminded that evidence is anything that supports a proposition, while proof is what demonstrates a proposition is true. They constantly bait and switch between the two.
Oh, don't be a douche. You know perfectly well that what's actually being asked for is the same, whether people are using the words in the strict technical sense or more colloquially. Scientific evidence. Scientific evidence is evidence which serves to either support or counter a scientific theory or hypothesis. Such evidence is expected to be empirical evidence and interpretation in accordance with the scientific method. You know perfectly well that that's what's being demanded of you, and if you didn't know, then I expect that that deficiency has now been rectified.
The evidence against an indetectable Santa that sings them sweet lullabies each night is simple. It explains no phenomena, and so it's entirely arbitrarily imagined. Innately, we know that things entirely arbitrarily imagined are unlikely to be true. Perhaps this is because limitless things can be arbitrarily imagined, but the universe is finite. The same logic doesn't work against God, of course, because God is perhaps the best explanation for all phenomena.
Then why is it that, every time we research something which has, until then, been attributed to God, we find such a creator's participation to be superfluous? So far, God has proved to be the best explanation for nothing, other than a lot of people behaving like assholes or idiots anyway.
Probably the simplest way to expose a lack of belief atheist is to ask one simple question. Which does he think is more probable, God or no God? I've never had an atheist say anything other than no God to this question, and then all you need to do is ask him why, and suddenly he has to give you positive reasons to justify the belief that 2 minutes ago he was denying he ever had.
Why do I think that God is the less likely explanation? Because having examined religious claims and compared them to the available data, they've failed to meet their burden of proof and were often outright contradicted. So I think they're awfully unlikely to be so. I have no burden of proof because my position is critical of yours and not a claim unto itself. The theist is the one under the spotlight here because without their claim of a God's existence, we wouldn't even be having a conversation about it.
The important thing is that even if an atheist wants to deny that a belief in probability is identical to a belief held to a degree of certainty, the main thing is that he has to face his burden of proof, which is identical either way.
These atheists have a burden of proof videos can always be boiled down to just 3 words. It's not fair. Theists obviously don't like it that they don't get to give as good as they get, that they're on the hook while others aren't. Trying to find a way to shift or share the burden of proof is just them being uncomfortable and squirming. Nothing more. Which of us is being intellectually dishonest, really? Hint, it's not the atheist. Right, so before I go, I've got another thank you. First up, a couple of t-shirts. This is Tron, my favorite movie, and I absolutely love having Tron shirts, so thank you for that one. Next up, I am such an 80s kid, so these stylized 80s sunsets, really cool. Love that stuff. Also, thank you. And also, a movie. What About Bob? Fun movie, and for some reason it was on my mind. I thought I already owned a copy, apparently not, so stuck it on my Amazon wishlist, and here it is, so thank you for that as well. There was a note with this stuff, a very lovely note, but no name, so while I definitely am grateful, I don't know who specifically to thank, and, well, that's a shame. Until next time, fellow space travelers, this is BionicDance saying don't run on automatic. Instead, please think. Scientific evidence is evidence which today we're talking to a new fella. Calls himself like so many before, he's a theist with sour grapes I've examined them and found them wanting, and thus I've discarded it. Blah. To show that the idea of the SFM. Besides, your holy text met. Besides, you're totally hexed. Scientific evidence is evidence which serves. Theists obviously don't like it that they don't get to get as give as they good as get of a day. What? Oh. These atheists have a burden of proof videos always boil down to fucking hell. I can't. Okay. These atheists have a burden of I'm losing ground. Oh, man, it's so bad.
Even YouTubers need Ferraris. Please donate on Patreon.
People not subscribing to BionicDance is one sign of the apocalypse. Save us all. Subscribe now.